They say a single dollar can't change a life. But on a cold London morning, when a homeless man named Marcus Jones asked Big Shaq for just $1, neither of them knew they were about to prove that wrong. What happened next shocked everyone, watching. Not because of the money, but because of a 20-year-old act of kindness that was finally coming full circle. This is a story about how the smallest gesture of kindness can grow into something extraordinary, about how a forgotten moment of compassion can return when you need it most, and about how sometimes, when you ask for a little help, the universe gives you back so much more than you ever imagined. Marcus pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders as another blast of winter wind whistled through the London streets. The cardboard sign in his lap fluttered, but he held it steady with trembling fingers. "Anything helps, God bless," it read in shaky black letters. From his spot on the corner of Oxford Street, he could see everything but somehow felt invisible. Hundreds of people walked by every hour, their eyes sliding past him like he was just another piece of the brick wall he leaned against. Some clutched shopping bags from fancy stores. Others carried steaming cups of coffee that made his empty stomach ache. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The thought made him close his eyes, remembering how different things had been just 3 months ago. Back then, he'd worn a blue uniform with his name stitched above the pocket. Marcus Jones, Quality, Supervisor, Patterson Food Packaging. He'd stood tall in steel-toed boots, walking the factory floor and checking that everything ran smoothly. The machines had hummed around him like faithful friends, and the other workers had greeted him with smiles and respectful nods. "Making sure we're all safe and fed," he used to say, when new employees asked what his job was. "That's what matters most in life." Now he was the one who wasn't safe or fed. The memory of his boss's face still haunted him. "I'm sorry, Marcus. The new owners are automating the whole line. Your position's being eliminated." 23 years at the factory, gone in a single meeting. He'd tried to find other work, of course. But at 45, with most of his experience in outdated systems, the rejections piled up faster than the bills. His savings disappeared into his landlord's pocket, until finally, there wasn't enough left for another month's rent. A group of teenage girls walked past, giggling at their phones. One of them glanced his way and quickly looked down, pulling her friends closer to the shop windows. Marcus didn't blame them. He barely recognized himself these days when he caught his reflection in store windows. His face was thinner, his beard scraggly, his clothes stained despite his best efforts to stay clean using bathroom sinks. The wind picked up again, and Marcus shifted his weight on the flattened cardboard box he used as a cushion against the cold pavement. His joints ached from sitting so long, but he'd learned that people were more likely to help if you stayed in one spot. They got used to seeing you, started to think of you as part of the neighborhood rather than a threat. Sometimes they even smiled, like that kind woman from the bakery who sometimes brought him day-old bread, or the businessman who'd given him a new pair of socks last week. Small kindnesses that kept him going, that reminded him he was still human. His stomach growled loudly, and Marcus pressed a hand against it, trying to quiet the sound. The last thing he'd eaten was half a sandwich he'd found in a bin behind Pret-a-Manger. The thought of how far he'd fallen made his eyes burn, but he blinked back the tears. Crying wouldn't help, and it only scared people away. Instead, he focused on watching the crowds, reading their faces like he used to read the gauges on his machines. Most hurried past with that blank London stare, but every now and then, someone's eyes would soften with recognition of his humanity. Those were the ones who might help. A tall figure caught his attention, moving through the crowd like a ship parting waves. The man wore an expensive winter coat and walked with the confidence of someone who knew they belonged anywhere they went. People were turning to look at him, some pulling out their phones to take pictures. Marcus straightened slightly, hope flickering in his chest. The man was getting closer, and there was something about his face, a kindness in his eyes that Marcus hadn't seen in a long time. Before he could talk himself out of it, Marcus found himself reaching for the courage to do something he rarely did. He was going to speak up and ask for help. The wind gusted again, carrying the sound of excited whispers. "Is that Big Shaq?" Marcus watched as more phones appeared in the crowd. Their cameras pointed at the approaching figure. The tall man in the expensive coat was talking on his phone, but he still managed to smile and nod at the people calling out to him. "Big Shaq, can we get a picture?" Without missing a beat in his phone conversation, Big Shaq paused to pose with a group of excited teenagers. His laugh boomed across the street, warm and genuine. "Quick one, yeah?" he said, holding up his signature pose while the kids crowded around him. Marcus had heard of Big Shaq before. Everyone had. His songs played in the factory sometimes, making the workers laugh and dance while they packed boxes. But seeing him in person was different. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly who they were. More people gathered around, but Big Shaq handled them all with grace. He signed a paper for a little boy, complimented a woman's jacket, asked a man about his day. It wasn't just for show. Marcus could tell the star really cared about people. The phone conversation continued between photos. "Yeah, bruv, the album's dropping next month." "No, man. I want it perfect. These people deserve our best work." Marcus watched how differently everyone treated Big Shaq compared to how they treated him. When people saw Marcus, they crossed the street. When they saw Big Shaq, they crossed the street to get closer. The thought made his empty stomach feel even hollower. But there was something else about Big Shaq that caught Marcus's attention. Between the photos and phone call, when nobody was watching, a different expression crossed the star's face. Something thoughtful, almost sad, like he was remembering something from long ago. The wind whipped down the street again, sending a shiver through Marcus's thin jacket. The movement must have caught Big Shaq's eye, because suddenly he was looking right at Marcus. Their eyes met across the crowd. Marcus's heart pounded. Most people looked away quickly when they noticed him, but Big Shaq's gaze stayed steady. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just a flash of recognition. But that couldn't be right. The star was getting closer now, still on his phone, but walking slower. The crowd parted around him, some people finally noticing Marcus and giving him those familiar looks of discomfort or disgust. But Big Shaq kept looking back at him between greeting fans. Marcus gripped his cardboard sign tighter. He usually stayed quiet, letting the sign do the talking. Speaking up meant risking rejection, ridicule, or worse. But something about Big Shaq's face gave him courage, a kindness that reminded him of better days. Time seemed to slow as Big Shaq came closer. Marcus could hear his voice more clearly now. "Yeah, bruv. Just walking down Oxford Street." Wait a second. This was his chance. Before he could talk himself out of it, Marcus gathered every bit of courage he had left. His voice came out rough from lack of use, but clear enough to be heard. "Excuse me, sir. Can you spare $1?" The words hung in the air between them. Big Shaq stopped mid-sentence on his phone, his eyes widening slightly. The crowd went quiet, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. And in that moment, something changed in Big Shaq's expression. Something that made Marcus wonder if he just made a huge mistake or the best decision of his life. "Let me "Call you back," Big Shaq said into his phone, his voice soft but different somehow. The crowd around them shifted nervously, unsure what was happening. Some people were already recording with their phones, probably expecting something dramatic. Marcus wanted to disappear into the brick wall behind him. Maybe he shouldn't have said anything. Maybe he should have just stayed quiet, like always. His cardboard sign suddenly felt heavy in his hands. But Big Shaq wasn't walking away. Instead, he was looking at Marcus with an intensity that made the etui-tui, rest of the world, fade away. The star's face had changed completely. Gone was the easy smile he'd worn for photos. Now he looked almost shaken. $1? Big Shaq repeated, and something in his voice made Marcus's heart skip a beat. It wasn't angry or annoyed. It was emotional? The wind picked up again, and Marcus pulled his thin jacket tighter. "Yes, sir," he managed to say. Anything would help. Someone in the crowd snickered. Another person whispered something about not encouraging beggars. But Big Shaq didn't seem to hear any of it. He took a step closer to Marcus, then another. "What's your name?" Big Shaq asked, his voice still carrying that strange emotion. Marcus swallowed hard. "Marcus," he said. "Marcus Jones." Big Shaq's eyes widened just slightly at the name. He glanced down at his expensive coat, then back at Marcus's thin jacket. Without hesitation, he did something that made the crowd gasp. He sat down on the cold pavement, right next to Marcus. "Marcus Jones," Big Shaq repeated, like he was testing out the words. "From East London?" Marcus's mouth went dry. "Yes. How did you—" "Used to work at Patterson Food Packaging," Big Shaq continued, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. The factory's name hit Marcus like a physical blow. "How do you know that?" Big Shaq smiled, but it wasn't his camera-ready smile from before. This one was smaller, sadder, full of memory. "Because," he said quietly, 20 years ago, when I was just a skinny kid with nothing but dreams, you did something that changed my life." Marcus's mind raced, trying to remember. 20 years ago? The factory had seen hundreds of workers come and go. He'd tried to be kind to everyone, but "I don't—" Marcus started to say, but Big Shaq held up a hand. "You wouldn't remember," he said, "but I never forgot. And now—" He looked around at the crowd, at the phones still recording, at the expensive shops lining the street. "Now I think it's time for me to return the favor." Big Shaq reached into his coat pocket, but what he pulled out wasn't $1. It was his phone. $1 won't help you, Marcus," he said, already dialing a number. "But I know what will." And as Marcus watched Big Shaq make that call, he had no idea that his entire life was about to change. All because of something he'd done 20 years ago and completely forgotten. As Big Shaq waited for someone to answer his mind traveled back 20 years to a very different London street. He'd been Michael then, just Michael, a skinny 17-year-old with worn-out trainers and big dreams. His mum had been sick that winter. The heating in their flat barely worked, and there were more bills than money to pay them. He'd seen the worry in her eyes every time she looked at the stack of envelopes on the kitchen table. "It's fine, love," she'd tell him, trying to smile. "Something will work out." But he'd hear her crying at night when she thought he was asleep. Young Michael had tried everything to help. He delivered papers, washed cars, anything to bring home a few extra pounds. But it was never enough. Not with the medicine his mum needed. Then came that cold Tuesday morning when he'd stood outside Patterson Food Packaging, staring up at the big brick building. He'd heard they were hiring, but the sign said, experience required. His heart had sunk. He had no experience, and he looked even younger than his 17 years. But he'd gone in anyway, because his mom needed him to try. The factory floor had been overwhelming. Loud machines, people in uniforms, the smell of industrial cleaner. He'd felt so out of place in his too big second-hand suit jacket. That's when he'd met Marcus Jones. "Can I help you?" Marcus had asked, and something in his kind eyes had given Michael courage. "I need a job, sir," he'd blurted out. "Any job. I'll work harder than anyone." He'd expected to be turned away. Instead, Marcus had really looked at him, seen past his shabby clothes to something else. "Why do you need this job so badly?" he'd asked. So Michael had told him about his mum, about the bills, about wanting to make things better. And Marcus had listened. Really listened. "Experience required," Marcus had said finally, looking at the clipboard in his hands. Then he'd smiled and added, "But looking after your mum? That's the most important experience there is." Marcus had given him a chance that day. Entry-level position, packing boxes on the night shift so he could still finish school. It hadn't been much money, but it had been enough. Enough to keep the heat on, enough for his mum's medicine, enough to give him a foothold to climb higher. Now, sitting on the cold pavement next to a Marcus who didn't remember him, Big Shaq felt the weight of 20 years between then and now. He'd gone from packing boxes to making music, from council, flats to platinum records. His mom lived in a nice house now, with a garden she loved, and it all started because one man had seen past his desperation to his potential. "Hello?" a voice answered on the phone. "Mr. Johnson here." Big Shaq glanced at Marcus, who was watching him with confused eyes. "Mr. Johnson," he said into the phone, "remember that restaurant chain we bought last month? The one that needs good people?" "Yes, of course," came the reply. "I found someone perfect for that management position we were discussing. Someone with 23 years of supervision experience." As he spoke, Big Shaq remembered something else Marcus had said to him that first day at the factory. Sometimes, people just need someone to believe in them. Now, it was his turn to believe in Marcus. 23 years of supervision experience? Marcus asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Are you talking about me?" Big Shaq nodded, still on the phone. "Can you meet him today?" he asked Mr. Johnson. "Yes, excellent. We'll be there in an hour." The crowd around them had grown larger, but Big Shaq didn't seem to notice. He ended the call and turned to Marcus, his eyes bright with purpose. "You asked me for $1, Big Shaq said. "But that's not what you need, is it?" Marcus looked down at his worn shoes. "I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" "Because once, a long time ago, you taught me something important." Big Shaq's voice was gentle. "You taught me that everyone deserves a chance to prove themselves." A memory flickered in Marcus's mind. How many young people had he helped over the years? How many chances had he given? The faces blurred together after so long. "I did?" he asked. Big Shaq stood up, brushing off his expensive coat. Then he reached down and offered Marcus his hand. "Let me tell you about a skinny kid named Michael who came to your factory 20 years ago." Marcus took the offered hand, his legs stiff from sitting so long on the cold ground. As he stood, Big Shaq continued talking. His mum was sick. They needed money for medicine. No one would hire him because he was too young, had no experience. Big Shaq's voice grew softer. But then he met a supervisor named Marcus Jones. Something stirred in Marcus's memory. A desperate young man in a too big suit jacket. Those determined eyes. You looked at my application, Big Shaq said, and you could have just said no. Everyone else had. But instead, you asked me why I needed the job. Marcus's eyes widened. Michael? The night shift boy? Big Shaq's face broke into a huge smile. You remember? You worked harder than anyone I'd ever seen, Marcus said slowly, the memories coming back. Always staying late, learning everything you could. And you became Big Shaq? People in the crowd were whispering, filming this moment on their phones, but neither man noticed. They were lost in memories of a different time, a different London. That job saved my family, Big Shaq said. Saved my life, really. Gave me the stability I needed to start making music. And it all happened because you saw something in me worth believing in. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes. I just tried to give people a fair chance. And now it's my turn. Big Shaq pulled out his phone again, swiping through screens. I own a chain of restaurants. Good ones. And we need someone who knows how to manage people, how to run quality control, how to give others a chance. But I've been... Marcus gestured at his ragged clothes, his cardboard sign. You've been down on your luck, Big Shaq corrected firmly. Just like I was. Just like so many people are. But that doesn't change who you are, or what you can do. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out and opened the back door. Now, Big Shaq said, how about we go meet Mr. Johnson and talk about your new job? And maybe get some food first. I know a great place nearby. Marcus stood frozen, overwhelmed by how quickly everything was changing. I don't know what to say. Big Shaq smiled that warm, genuine smile again. You could say yes, like you did for me 20 years ago. And as Marcus took his first step toward the car, toward his new future, he realized something amazing. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness could change lives in ways you'd never expect. He'd given a young man a chance 20 years ago and forgotten about it. But that young man had never forgotten. Now that chance was coming back to him, multiplied 1,000 times over. The restaurant was warm and smelled amazing. Marcus sat across from Big Shaq at a quiet corner table, still trying to process everything that had happened in the last hour. His old cardboard sign was gone, left behind on that cold street corner, like a memory of a different life. Eat whatever you want, Big Shaq said, pushing the menu toward him. The chef here is brilliant. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the menu. Just this morning, he'd been wondering if he'd eat at all today. Now he was sitting in one of London's finest restaurants, about to meet the man who might give him a job. I still can't believe you're that skinny kid from the factory, Marcus said, shaking his head. Michael, you were always staying late, asking questions about how everything worked. Big Shaq smiled. Remember what you told me when I asked to learn about the quality control systems? Marcus thought for a moment, then laughed softly. I think I said something like, if you're going to do a job, learn to do it right. Because everything we do matters to someone, Big Shaq finished. I've never forgotten that. Used it in my music even. Every song matters to someone, just like every package mattered to someone. A waiter appeared with 2 steaming cups of tea. Marcus wrapped his cold hands around the warm cup, breathing in the familiar comfort of proper English tea. But there's something else you should know, Big Shaq said, his voice growing serious. The restaurant chain isn't just any business. It's the old Patterson Food Building. Marcus nearly spilled his tea. What? Big Shaq nodded. When I heard they were closing the factory, I bought it. couldn't bear to see it torn down, converted it into a restaurant and training center. We teach young people cooking, business skills, give them their first chance, just like you gave me. Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes again. The factory had been his home for so many years. To think it was still there, still helping people. And now, Big Shaq continued, I need someone who understands both food production and people. Someone who knows how to spot potential in others. Someone who remembers what it's like to need a chance. A tall man in a business suit approached their table. Mr. Johnson, Big Shaq said, standing to shake his hand. Meet Marcus Jones, the man who changed my life. As Marcus stood to shake Mr. Johnson's hand, he realized something profound. When he'd asked Big Shaq for $1, he'd been hoping for just enough to survive another day. Instead, he'd gotten something far more valuable. A reminder that every kind act, no matter how small it seems, can grow into something amazing. The real gift wasn't the job offer, though that would change his life. The real gift was knowing that 20 years ago, when he'd chosen kindness, he'd helped set in motion a chain of events that would end up helping countless others. And as they sat down to discuss his new role, Marcus made a silent promise. He would make sure that this chance, like the one he'd given young Michael so long ago, would multiply again and again, spreading hope to others who just needed someone to believe in them. That's exactly what Big Shaq has been doing ever since. That day, finding new ways to pass on kindness to others. Just last week, he showed us again how a simple act of compassion can change lives. If you thought this story touched your heart, wait until you see what happened when Big Shaq spotted a struggling mother at the airport. He didn't just offer her his first-class seat. What happened next left everyone on the plane in tears. Click the link above to watch Big Shaq gives his first-class seat to a struggling mother. What happens next is unbelievable. And hey, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below telling us your city and country. Let's see how far these stories of kindness can spread around the world.